agency. We are a sports representation agency focusing on basketball. Because of the sort of changing nature of the business, we've also in the last couple of years spent a lot of time working in the NIL space as well, mostly with the idea of representing clients that we want to represent ultimately professionally. And so starting to work with them on their marketing efforts while they're still in school, and assisting them in negotiating with the collectives, finding deals in the marketplace, both locally, nationally, regionally, nationally, and just developing that relationship of trust and comfort, and then hopefully transitioning that over into professional representation.
Great. Sounds really interesting. I will assault you with all of my NIL questions in a minute. Especially, I want to get into a little discussion about what the hell are collectives up to, which everybody wants to know, and a little bit about sort of the life of deals. But before we get to that, our usual follow-up question is, so you've been in this the law sports business for a while. Talk to us a little bit about your path out of law school and how you ended up where you are today.
Sure. So after law school, I worked at a small firm, litigation-based firm in LA for 5 or 6 years. And then I got a job at the NBA Players Association shortly after Billy Hunter had become executive director. And I spent the next 12 years working at the Players Association. At the time, I marvel at how large they are now. I think they have closing in on like 100 employees. I don't think we ever passed 20, 22, 23. And so, by nature of our size, we all wore a lot of different hats. So while I was there, I was part of our collective bargaining team. So negotiated 2 full and part of 1 agreement, negotiated 3 WNBA CBAs, helped actually form the WNBA Players Association. I was part of the litigation team for disputes with the NBA on basketball related income issues, CBA issues, represented players in disputes with or grievances with their teams or the league, including representing Latrell Sprewell in his when he attacked PJ Carlesimo, and representing Jermaine O'Neal and others in the aftermath of the Malice at the Palace, which, by the way, for anyone who hasn't seen it, it's an excellent documentary on Netflix. Gives you some great insight into a lot of the behind the scenes stuff that was going on there. And just did a lot of other things at the PA. It was a great experience. Really enjoyed my time there. But going into my 12th year there, Arn Tellem had reached out to me about potentially coming over. Arn had sold his business to Wasserman Media Group a couple of years before, and they were growing the business quite a bit. So Arn asked me to come over and serve as his chief operating officer to help him run the sports division at Wasserman. So was happy to do that. It was, an opportunity to go back to LA, which, I loved, and went to law school at UCLA and then worked out there for the first few years of my career. So that was very compelling, and the chance to work with Arn, who, for those who know, is really one of the Hall of Fame agent. There was a Hall of Fame for agents. Arn would be one of the unanimous members. Not only was he probably the most dominant agent in basketball for most of his career, but Arn also was always one of the top 2 or 3 agents in baseball as well. So, the chance to go, work and learn with Arn was a tremendous opportunity. So jumped at that, was there for about 3 years. My wife's a native New Yorker. She wasn't a big fan of Los Angeles. So I thought my daughter would be the tiebreaker, but she actually went against me. And so we moved back to New York and went to work at Excel Sports. Was at Excel for about 4.5 years as general counsel. Started a new business line while I was there, representing coaches, broadcasters, and front office executives. Excel had a bunch of clients who were getting to that point in their career where they were thinking about what was next. And so I worked with, among others, Barry Larkin, Jason Kidd, Nota Begay, and others as they transition from their playing careers into their their next stages of their careers. And I actually took that business and eventually created my own business called Sideline Sports Management, which is now part of 7-One. I left Excel to run a players association for professional gamers, the LCS Players Association. We formed the first players association in esports. That was sort of an interesting thing. I was contacted about whether or not I was interested in meeting and interviewing for the position to help create this association. I was interested in it because I thought the opportunity to run my own players association would be really interesting and fun. And I could, having not only been at the NBPA, but having been exposed to the other players associations through my work at Excel and Wasserman, as well as at the NBPA, I thought there was a chance to really sort of create something new and different in a new and different sport. And so, was really interested in the idea of it. The funny thing was that Riot, which is the game developer, was the one who sort of came up with the idea of creating a players association to benefit the players. So there were some issues that we had to make sure were resolved around that Riot was going to have a hands-off policy, and we were going to be able to be an association that was truly for the players. Once we sort of resolved those issues, I went through the process, was selected by the players who voted, and then ran the LCSPA for about 4 years until Jermaine and Tracy reached out to me about coming over to 7-One. So,
well, it's a lot of experience and a lot of different paths, which I think's an interesting thing because, it's that old line about what does a lawyer do? Our job is doing homework and writing papers. So we're always studying, we're always learning, and there's, with the blinders off, there's new opportunities. And you've just described sort of that. Well, I was doing this, and then I got this opportunity to sort of do a pivot. And I think that's what we get to do as lawyers, is problem solve, and we have a toolkit and we just adapt it. So for you, going into, coming out of a traditional sports universe and then getting into the esports realm, when you did, it was definitely an upward calculus in the esports world. It seems that today, you've got some consolidation, some people getting out of the business. I think there was a big hurt in the esports world because of COVID when they stopped having all those crazy live events. And for those of you out there that have never been to a live esports event, put it on your bucket list.
Gotta go.
So there's been a lot of changes. Do you, sort of just looking into your own crystal ball, do you think it's coming back, or is it on a downward trend? How do you see the market there?
It's a really good question. And by the way, one thing, I want to go back a little bit. One of the interesting things about COVID was esports. In some ways, it actually was beneficial to esports because it was really one of the only sporting activities that was able to continue, where everything else was put on like a hard stop. Esports was able to quickly pivot. And basically, instead of events being in person on a stage at a venue, everyone went remote. And, there were some complications around it, but for the most part, the caliber of the competition didn't change. And so, and esports actually got some publicity and some activity that it wouldn't have gotten otherwise. Like the gamblers found it. So that was beneficial in some ways. And the other thing, it was on, there were different competitions on ESPN and some other big media outlets that would have never hosted esporting events, but for the fact that they had no other content during that time. So there was a little bit of a spike in COVID and in the immediate aftermath. I think that a lot of those viewers have sort of, gone back to whatever they were watching before esports. So there's, I think there was a lot of excitement about, the potential for growth because there were these increased numbers. New sponsors were coming in because they had money to spend and nowhere to spend it. I think that's all sort of tapered off. one of the challenges of esports is always changing technology. The games change. A new game comes along that's more interesting, has better graphics, has different attributes that make it interesting to people. So there's always, unlike traditional sports where, football doesn't really change that much, basketball doesn't really change that much. Baseball changes a little bit around the margins, pitch clocks and wider bases and things like that. But, these are all like very small changes that happen incrementally over many years, whereas in esports, changes are much faster and tend to be much more dynamic. So I think that, there was certainly a period of time in like the late teens where esports was really hot. People couldn't invest money fast enough in it. We've definitely seen that fall off, and it's hard to say exactly where it's going. I think there's a very strong core audience. I think they have to figure out how to grow that beyond that core audience and grow on the margins.
Yeah, it's really interesting because the gaming environment, not talking about the professional gamers, but
Right.
gaming itself doesn't seem to be slowing down, and they're still selling billions of dollars of games and units and whatnot. So it's not there, but it's the sporting side of it that seems to have taken a slippage. And it's more in terms of, as you said, in the late teens, there was a lot of VC money flowing in all over the place.
Right.
And I think that's been pulled back dramatically. I'm not really sure why.
Well, not just from esports, but from everywhere, really.
Yeah. But you also seen in esports, a lot of big teams sort of selling out certain franchises. They want to unloading certain teams.
Yep.
And it's been interesting. And then you had somebody like FaZe Clan who became a media company, and they were public and they wanted to go private, and not really sure what it is anymore. So I think they're still trying to find footing, but the games themselves have a huge popularity. It's just, I'm not sure where the future of esports is right now, if it's on a hold pattern with a chance to go up. It's an interesting watch anyway.
Yeah. Well, I was just the LCS, the league I worked with, they just finished their spring split, and their numbers were lower than they've been historically by a not insignificant amount. And so but the spring split's never all that popular, and it's not, it all built up to the summer split and the worlds and everything like that. So there's definitely been some slippage. You mentioned FaZe Clan. They were hoping to be like the first unicorn in esports when they went with their public offering. They ended up not selling for over $1 billion. I think they ended up getting like $730 million, which is still a huge valuation for a company that has revenues in the $50-60 million range. So I think there's still a lot of people who believe in esports and are just trying to figure out how to best chart a path forward.
Yeah. Well, let's step away from your esports past, but I think it's an interesting topic because again, it was so hot, and then it sort of has calmed down, and I'm just interested to see what happens. And the appetite was huge, and it's changed. But if you look at the more traditional sports, which now clearly has to include the NWSL when you're talking about MLS and Major League Baseball and everything, women's sports are finally stepping up.
Run by my dear friend Jessica Berman, who's doing a great job.
Our dear friend Jessica.
Our dear
Berman.
friend, exactly, doing a tremendous job.
Yeah, and I think you also look at the success of the NC2A women's tournament this year. It crushed. It was extraordinary.
Almost doubled its prior numbers.
Really, yeah, which was great. And anybody that wants to tell you that they ain't playing basketball doesn't know anything about basketball.
No.
I mean, their game, the ball movement, the kind of shots they were taking, it's fun.
Yeah.
And the men's game this year was interesting because you had a Final Four of who? Which I think, and the ratings weren't very good. And the games, I mean, the final game was sort of I hate to say it wasn't really exciting. It's, no Butler missed half court shot, but,
No.
and the ratings were down, which is raises a lot of other interesting questions about that feature. I mean, it's still strong. When we say it's down, it's still monumentally a strong property.
Right.
So looking to the college space, and you talked about it earlier, and it's been one of the big issues. I mean, we are not yet 2 years into the world of NIL, right? We're 22 months in basically to the world of NIL.
Yeah.
And it's a really interesting problem when you're representing, I think, athletes in the space, because number one, there's no national rules. Number two, Alston cut off something from the NCAA, reminding them that they don't have an antitrust exemption.
Right.
And with some states with some rules, some states don't have rules. In the space, it seems everybody I've talked to that's working in it as representing the talent, their best friend is compliance officers at a university.
Absolutely. First thing we do when we sign a new client is reach out to the compliance person in charge.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people don't really understand, and there's some confusion here, and it'd really be helpful if you could talk to us for a minute about representing these collegiate athletes, the term of that representation, what happens when they leave school, graduate, whatever, and what happens when they turn pro. That seems to be, there's a lot of interconnectivity, but there have to be certain walls. How do you guys deal with that whole relationship?
Yeah, I mean, it's as you said, it's a little complicated. You have to make sure you know the rules of every state in which you're dealing. If they're, do they have rules? Has the state, and does the state have legislation that governs it? If not, then you're falling back on whatever, sort of loose rules the NCAA has created. We also, as I said, we call the compliance officer. Each schools have different rules about, how they want their contracts reported. What you have to upload, what you don't, what you have to, what the school allows in terms of use of their marks, things like that. So you work through all those things. The relationship with the players, it's sort of all over the place depending on who they are and what their NIL opportunities are. When you're working with, we work with a couple of big stars. Drew Timmy's probably our biggest client. Drew's done well into the 7 figures on deals over the last 2 years. And and also has like a big deal from his collective. We negotiated agreements with 3 or 4 different collectives this past year on behalf of clients. So there's a lot to navigate, there's a lot to maneuver, there's a lot to make sure you're aware of, from a rule perspective. And then you're developing a relationship with the client, and hopefully you're setting your expectations properly. Making sure that they understand that, just because this is a possibility doesn't mean it's a probability. But you're going to work hard, you're going to try to find deals and bring them to them, and everybody hopefully will get some benefit out of it. We're not in it it's not really a revenue generating mechanism for us so much as it is a client development path, where we're just working on behalf of these clients, and hopefully we've done a good enough job that when it's time for them to make the decision to turn pro, they want to continue to work with us.
Which raises the most interesting question of the last year. Are these athletes that are making NIL money, some good money, and suddenly they're not so ready to rush out into the world, and they're saying, I'll stay for my 5th year. I'll stay another year. And I think that's so interesting, because so often kids would say, I'm going to jump because I got to make some money. I'm going to go to the pros now. And we've seen in the last year, both in the men's and women's side in basketball, where people saying, not so quick. I'm going to come back. So it's interesting, because for the first time as a collegiate athlete, I can say, well, I made X 100,000 this year and had a good season. I can come back and I can make this much the next year. If I leave school and I'm a 2nd round pick what are my odds of staying on the team? How long am I going to make it? I mean, there's a whole different analysis going into the transition from a collegiate athlete to a pro athlete. And I would imagine that advising your clients in that space is almost like a math problem. Well, you're earning this much now, but if you go here, even if you make the minimum, it's this. But I mean, how do you juggle all of these factors?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it is a little bit of a challenge. I think at the core, I've been around basketball and basketball players for a long time, and anybody that thinks that it's playing at a level where they think they have a professional career as a strong prospect is ultimately going to want to get to that as soon as possible. There are some different motivations to go back. If you end up, if you go through the pre-draft process and it shows that you're, a second round pick, as opposed to a first round pick where, there's less guaranteed money and less opportunity, perhaps. I think, for those players, there's a different calculation about whether you go back to school, especially if there's significant NIL money available. But most players, if they think the opportunity is ripe, they're still gonna go for the NBA. I think it is different in the women's game where WNBA salaries are so much less. I mean, even in the NBA, a minimum salary is $600,000. So that's a lot of NIL money you got to make up to get to that. But the top end salary in the WNBA is in the low 200s. For rookies, I think it's in the high 60s or 70s, depending on where you are and drafted in the first round. So, for a Caitlin Clark or an Angel Reese or a lot of other players, they may have to give serious thought to whether or not they stay for an extra year, especially if there's potentially, 7 figures available to them through NIL. The other thing for a lot of making the WNBA is so hard. There's only 140 something roster spots. And there are a lot of really good players, and really good college players don't make the WNBA coming straight out of college oftentimes. So, again, another reason to, if you're making good NIL money, maybe it's worth staying and being a legend at your school, pursuing a championship and making some NIL money. Those are all compelling things.
Well, I think it's also compelling as a sports fan to just sort of look at the WNBA and say, all right, your salaries are really low. Even your top salaries are really low, which is why these women have been traveling all over the world to play 2 seasons to make a living. Yeah. And now one of those countries, namely Russia, is no longer a place for these women to make money. So the question is the WNBA going to find a way to start paying? And we're not going to get right now to NBA money, but they've got to be more competitive. Otherwise, I think, a lot of women, if they're, top players, financially, I want to play in the WNBA, but I can make more money if I stay in school my junior and senior year than I can go into the WNBA.
No, it's definitely it's a change that the WNBA definitely needs to get to. But I've always I've sat across the table from them and negotiated. I've seen their balance sheets, and there is a fair point about, how much money they are making versus, what their expenses are. And I still think there's a lot more room for them to pay the players a lot more than they're making, but it's going to be a really, really long time before we see WNBA players approach the salaries of NBA players. But, I think expansion's important. Like, I think they need to grow the game, beyond just the teams that they have now and, get into new markets. Like, clearly women's basketball is really popular right now, especially the college game. Let's try to take that momentum and build out the WNBA.
Yeah, I think they can, again, look to the folks at the NWSL, and, they're adding 2 franchises more next year. And they've got like our own Angel City here in LA selling out every game.
That's amazing.
So I think there's a lot of opportunity. The WNBA needs to get, I think they can start to get more seats, more butts in the seats in the stadiums, which is always an important factor. And, maybe on the media space, they're going to say, well, maybe there is some action here on getting an audience, especially after the recent NCAA tournament.
Yeah, I do also think, and you probably know more about this than I do, I'm sure, but I think that the WNBA, ideally should decouple from the NBA in term when they resell their media rights. Let's see, what's a separate package going to get you?
Yeah, I don't think it's like the old affiliation discussions where you can have this one of our networks, but you got to take these other three to get us some carriage. I
Exactly.
think that they need to stand on their own, but we'll see what happens. You know, we're sort of getting to the end, but I really want one thing we didn't touch on and we brushed over, which is a subject that is complicated, but I'd really like it if you could give us a 30,000-foot little discussion on the NIL collective and how they're operating, and it seems they're not all operating the same way.
There's a huge range in how the collectives operate. I mean, first of all, there's a huge range in how much money they have. You know, you've got some collectives with, you know, where, you know, particularly like the larger state schools, you know, like University of Texas, for instance, just, you know, throw them out there, like gigantic school, a lot of really wealthy alums, who are, you know, very connected to their university. You know, it's very easy for them to raise a lot of money, throw it at a lot of athletes, and you know, and use that to their, you know, to their university's advantage. You've got other schools that, you know, have trouble scraping together six figures, you know, to divide amongst their athletes. So, you know, that's one big issue. The resources that they put toward their collectives, you know, you know, that very gray line between the collectives and the universities and how they interact. You know, I mean, obviously there's got to be some communication back and forth because, you know, the collective can't decide who the school wants to recruit. But, you know, the coaches have to, you know, be very hands off in the discussions around, you know, monetary discussions. So it's a really, it's still such a new space. I think there's a lot, you know, the ones that were first out of the gate and have sort of, you know, put together a good model have been really successful in terms of using the collectives to bolster the kind of, you know, athletes that they're recruiting. I think a lot of places will eventually catch up, but there are also going to be a lot of schools that just never figure it out and have to figure out a different model in order to stay competitive. Whether it's, you know, I think you'll see a lot more schools that can't, you know, work the collectives the way that some of these other places can, focus more on the development model. They'll go back to, you know, finding 3 and, you know, 2, 3, 4-star kids, bringing them in, you know, developing them as best they can and hope they don't get plucked out of the portal, you know, from a bigger school that has, you know, a lot of collective money to throw at them.
Yeah, well, the portal, that's a whole other thing I'm not going to get into, but I mean, I remember when freshmen couldn't play varsity collegiate sports.
Yeah.
Okay.
Kareem Abdul-Jabbar played
which kept Lou Alcindor's freshman team, which beat the defending NC2A champion UCLA team in the preseason. That was quite a sight to see as a kid. And you've had those changes. You know, now with everybody saying there's no pay to play, and it seems there's a little wink going on there because you see these kids leaving, you know, they did okay at this kind of small school and they're moving to school at this big collective.
Yeah.
Better school. You know, it's changed the sport. And as I've told our friend Ken Shropshire, it's time to do a new edition of the miseducation of the student athlete, because I think there's been so many changes. And again, you know, call me Pollyanna, but can we talk about the educational opportunities for once? I mean, everybody seems to skip over those. And that to me is really sad. And, you know, paired with, you know, you hope that these schools, and I believe that they're working on it, are working not just in what the NIL rules are, but making a big effort on financial literacy, because too many of these kids have no clue. And without that understanding, they are just screwed.
Yeah, no, 100%. You have to make sure your clients, you know, that they understand that, you know, the money that they're receiving, you know, these 1099s, you know, these checks that they're getting, you know, that they're, you know, the taxes are not taken out. So set aside some money so that when, you know, in April, you know, you've got some money to pay your taxes on this income. And, you know, we spend a lot of time talking to our clients about, you know, how to manage their money. You know, we'll connect them. You know, we've got a network of people that we'll connect them with to help them, you know, with their financial management. And so it's important. It's a very important part of it to make sure that they understand, this money coming in and what it means. And it can be game changers for a lot of them. For a lot of them, it's just going to be a little extra money to have to, buy some nicer meals and, go out on a date or, put some
Yeah.
gas in your car. But, for others, it'll be hundreds of thousands of dollars and, maybe as much money as they see for a long time. So it's important that they understand, that this can really, benefit them down the line.
Absolutely. Well,
Plus,
look,
it's a good chance to, just to teach them about business
right. Which
contracts.
historically was never part of the athletic department's educational directives.
No.
Well, this has been great. I've really enjoyed our little conversation. But before I make my announcements, I got to ask you one hot button question.
Okay.
Draymond gets suspended?
I mean, I think so. Yeah, I know, I'm he was instigated, so I'm not, like that. I think that's the mitigating factor. But, given Draymond's history, I think he doesn't really get the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. Obviously my Warriors fans have a different perspective than everybody else in the basketball world.
Yeah.
Well, that's going to be a very interesting decision that'll come down probably later today or tomorrow. We'll see what happens, but Warriors will be home for the next game. It's going to be a very interesting environment in San Francisco.
Yeah, definitely.
Anyway, well, look, everybody. Hal, thank you for being here. Quick announcements. Sports Alert Association Annual Conference, Los Angeles, California. JW Marriott LA Live, May 11th through 13th. Early bird registration ends this Friday. We extended it a week or so to give people the opportunity to get in and save a few dollars. So please join us. It's going to be a great program, as it always is. And most importantly, the real value proposition is not looking at people in a Zoom, but seeing them face to face and catching up and hanging out and meeting people. And everybody's there to just talk and discuss. And for those of you that have never been, show up and walk up to either of us and say, "What's up?" And we'll chat with you about whatever questions you have. It's the nature of our organization. So I hope to see you all in LA. Hal, I know I'm going to see you in LA.
Can't wait.
And thank you everybody for watching today, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.